Good evening, everyone. I'm Amanda Thomas, and I'd like to welcome you to Science on Tap Online. Tonight, we are here to talk about when facts are not enough, public perception of science, with Dr. Allison Coffin. Allie is an associate professor of neuroscience at WSU Vancouver, where she primarily studies acoustic communication and hearing loss. And I have known Allie for a long time, and she's spoken at several of our Science on Tap in-person events, most notably An Animal's Guide to Dating Success, which you can find on our podcast, which, if you didn't know, we have a podcast. It's called A Scientist Walks into a Bar. And her talk is on episode number 22 on An Animal's Guide to Dating Success, and we will post a link to that on Facebook later. But tonight we are talking, one of her other roles is slightly more relevant. And let me get my slide to move forward. There we go. She is also the president of a nonprofit called Science Talk, which is who has the mission to empower and inspire the science communication community. And full disclosure, I am also on the board of Science Talk, and among our many goals are to share best practices for science communication and to help science communicators reach people across a lot of different media and platforms, which is relevant tonight since we are here online instead of in person. So if you are a scientist or you are interested in science communication, I encourage you to check out our website. It's on the bottom of the slide there. We have an annual conference, and normally held at the end of March, which we had to suddenly cancel this year and pivot to an online conference, which actually turned out quite well. So check us out. We are building an online community, and we hope to have an in-person conference and possibly also an online conference next year as well. And yeah, check us out, and I'm sure you will find some valuable information there. So for those of you who are new to Science on Tap, just wanted to give you a quick overview of what we do. We have been running in-person live events in Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington for around 7 years. And we like to make science accessible, particularly to adults, but we recognize that there may be some kids watching here this evening. Our in-person events are casual and they're held in a theater. You can see a picture on your screen of one of our venues, the lovely Alberta Rose Theater here in Portland. And we encourage people, if you want to have a beverage of choice, I have a ginger lemonade here this evening. But we encourage people, if you would like to have an adult beverage, a beer or wine or whatever, or whatever you would like, just to sit back and relax and have a casual evening. And the idea is just to make science fun and accessible to as many people as possible. We will be doing these online events every Thursday for the next several weeks. We have the several events coming up in May and also in June. The June ones aren't online yet, but they're coming soon. And this talk will be recorded, or is being recorded right now, and it will be available on Facebook and YouTube by tomorrow. So you can share with your friends or watch it again, I suppose. So what you can expect from this evening, our presentation is going to last about 45 minutes to an hour or so. You can ask questions. You can submit those through chat on Facebook or in Zoom. We have people who are there capturing the questions, and you can ask questions if you need to of those people, and also submit questions. They will send those to me. And then at the end of the talk, I will ask some of those questions to Allie, and she will join in the text chat at the end of the event as well. So if you have questions that we don't get to, or other questions, you're welcome to chat with her by text at the end there. Also want to say a quick note, if you are watching in Zoom, we do surveys at the end of all of these events to get feedback, and we've had a couple people say something like, oh, well, I wish the speaker would have been bigger or the slides would have been bigger. And I want to empower you that you should have, if you're watching in Zoom, you should have the ability to change the size of your respective windows there. So, drag and click and drag those windows accordingly if you can. So just wanted to mention that. Speaking of the survey afterward, you will be getting an email from us tomorrow that will have a survey link in it, and we'll also be posting it on Facebook. It's a good way for us to get some information on how we're doing, and also we would love it if you would put your zip code in there. There's a question. We can map out where people are coming from this evening, and would love to find out where everyone is from, because we know we have an audience in Portland and Vancouver, but it would be fun to see if there's people from other areas of the country as well. One more thing before we get started, just want to mention we do want to keep these events available and free to people online, both live and on recorded video. And we can only do that if we can get your support. So again, the event is free. We do ask for a $5 suggested cover if you are able to do that. If you aren't, that's fine. But if you are, we would greatly appreciate it. There's a couple ways you can donate. You can go to makeyouthink.org/support. Make You Think is our nonprofit partner, and do a one-time donation there. Or if you want to join our Patreon and get some cool gifts and things, you can go to patreon.com/makeyouthink, and I will include these links at the end of the event as well. Okay, with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and welcome our speaker to the stage. Welcome, Allie.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks everybody for tuning in from wherever you are. I'm really excited to be here. As Amanda said, I've spoken at a few Science on Tap events before. Although I take offense that one of my previous ones on animal dating isn't as relevant these days. I think the animals would say that their dating habits are always relevant, at least to them. However, science communication, public perception of science is more relevant these days for many of us and is really on our minds. So I'm excited to talk a bit there. As Amanda said, I am the co-founder and president of Science Talk. We are a science communication professional organization that started about 5 years ago. And our goal was really to empower science communicators, help form community, share best practices, and help science better impact society. Nowhere is scientific impact in society more relevant, I think, than today. As Amanda also said, I'm not just the president of Science Talk, I'm also a member. I am also a professor at Washington State University in Vancouver, where I study hearing and hearing loss. We are not currently conducting research. We are currently at home. This is just to show you my lab members and what they look like. And I'm going to take a moment now to ask for your support. Most of the researchers in my lab are students who are not just conducting cutting edge research, they are also working towards their futures, whether in biomedical research or as healthcare professionals. And right now we're facing tough choices about paying these students to continue their work when we're not actually able to be in the lab. So if you're able to support us, I ask that you go out to my website, labs.wsu.edu/allison.coffin, and donate to support our students so that they can continue to be paid, continue to pay their bills during this period, so that we can resume the research when it's safe to reopen the labs again. And this link will be up again at the end of my talk. Because science communication matters, and science matters in all of our lives, which is why we're here. Science has a huge impact around us. For example, in the number of extreme weather events and extreme events that we see, natural disasters associated with changing climate. This is a picture from one of the California fires in 2018, which devastated communities and cost so much. Of course, relevant to all of us right now, and why we're all on Zoom rather than enjoying a beverage together, is of course the coronavirus. Tonight, I'll talk a bit about public perception of science, a bit about what we know, what we might know, some about information and misinformation, and some about what we can do to correct some misinformation gently when we hear it. And I'll tell you right now, there isn't a really good answer there, but there's some research that can give us some clues. Just going to hit a few points of research along the way, and I'd like to save a lot of time at the end for questions. I also want to point out that most of the studies I'll talk about are done by surveying US adults, usually anywhere from 1,000 to 4,000 or so adults. And they try to generally represent a demographic sample of the US with a few exceptions, deliberate exceptions that I'll showcase as we go. Let's start with public understanding of science. How much do we, as the American public, and I'm going to lump all of us in together, recognizing that the American public is not all one thing, how much on average do Americans understand about science? This was a survey done by the Pew Research Center, published a couple of years ago, that asked what American adults know in terms of factual information about science. So from things like the Earth's hottest layer being the core, 86% of people recognizing that that was true or being able to identify the hottest layer. Now, this did come with a labeled picture. People didn't just have to come up with the idea of the core from scratch, down to only 30% of American adults knowing that water boils at a lower temperature at higher altitudes. And while I have no actual knowledge, I would bet that many of those people lived in Denver, because there, that information is relevant. What I think this really tells us is that American adults have varying degrees of knowledge about scientific facts, about information. What about this makes sense? Do we need to understand this information? And do Americans think we should know scientific information? There's another Pew study that was published the following year that instead asked, should Americans know more about science or not? Is this really a problem? And again, this was a survey of American adults. And the vast majority of American adults thought that it was either a big problem in maroon or a smaller problem in pink, that the public doesn't know enough about science to understand findings in the news. So these are people really saying about themselves, I think it's a problem that we don't understand enough about science. And similarly, that a significant proportion of people thought it was a problem that we, the public, jumped to conclusions about how to apply new scientific findings to our lives. I think this is particularly true now when we're getting just this flood of information on a daily basis about the coronavirus pandemic. And every time we get a new nugget of information, we feed that into the rest of the information in our brains. But that information changes because this is still an unfolding scenario. So we're jumping to all kinds of conclusions, maybe about something we heard on the radio or saw online today, without having a fuller picture. That's definitely a problem. But a question that I want to ask is, how much is it a problem that in general, not thinking about the current pandemic, but science information overall, is it really a problem if we don't know as many facts? Does knowledge matter? And I'm not saying we shouldn't know anything, but is knowledge a predictor for whether or not we're actually interested in and using scientific information? There was a study published a couple of years ago that measured scientific interest rather than information. I think this is an interesting study. What the researchers did was take a sample of a few thousand American adults and gave them one of these four categories. So a category of news stories online about either celebrities, science, sports, or finance. And asked the participants, if you were to get a story to read, an article to read from one of these four categories, which category would you pick? You can't pick a story, we're just going to give you one, but we'll let you pick the category. They also gave the participants some scientific information to read and asked questions to gauge their deliberation with that material, their interest in that material, as well as a quiz about scientific facts. So they gauged both interest and factual knowledge and looked at the relationship between the two. And what's interesting is that it's not a strong relationship. If you look across the bottom, that's the scientific curiosity scale. People that said, I want to read a story from that science column of articles, and I'm interested in engaging with the science material that you gave me to read. Whereas if you look along the side, that's ordinary scientific intelligence, which they were gauging of how many facts can you get right on this quiz about scientific information. People that were really interested in science still weren't necessarily doing that well on a scientific intelligence test. The researchers then applied the same idea of scientific intelligence versus curiosity to a very pressing question in our world, that of climate change and global warming. First, we're looking at scientific intelligence. So here they said, is there a correlation between scientific intelligence and whether or not somebody thinks that global warming is a major risk for human health and society? And we see what is often reported, which is this demographic split based on political identification, where liberal Democrats, the more scientific information they knew, the more liberal Democrats thought that climate change posed an extremely high risk to society. Whereas for conservative Republicans, the more scientific information they knew, the less they thought that climate change posed a threat to society. So we see this really big split based on knowing scientific information. That tells us that knowing science facts can lead to very different decisions or opinions. But things are different when the same researchers looked at scientific curiosity. Remember using those curiosity tests of how people were engaging with scientific material. And here, what they found in both cases, so for both liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, the greater the scientific curiosity, the more likely that individual was to think that climate change posed a risk. There's still a distinct split between those that identify in those different political ways, but the trend is the same in both cases. Science curiosity, in that case, actually matters. And it turns out people are interested in science. So this was another Pew survey. And here they were asking people about their interest in different sorts of news. The vast majority of the adults surveyed were interested in news about their local community. Not surprising. You want to know what's going on in your community, how a new regulation is going to affect you, or maybe whether or not there's going to be a parade in a given weekend, someday when we can return to parades. But science news ranked third here, with 71% of the participants saying they were interested in science news. So this is good news. If science curiosity is correlated with acceptance of well-established scientific information, like climate change, and people are interested in science news, that suggests a lot of people are curious about science. And we also know from some Pew surveys that people generally trust scientists. So going back to that 2016 Pew survey, this was looking at levels of trust for different segments of the American population. The US military was ranked the highest in terms of trust, but scientists came in a second. You can see then from there that we go down to elected officials being the lowest on the trust scale, at least for these categories. I don't think that's a blanket statement overall. Another study also gauged who people trust when it comes to learning scientific information. So it was a study published a couple of years ago now, and asked people where they like to get their scientific information, what they thought were the most trustworthy sources. And from left to right, the news was the least trustworthy source, at least in this survey. Friends and family, personal contacts were considered more trustworthy. Universities, they're shown as my own campus, WSU Vancouver, were considered yet more trustworthy. And the most trustworthy sources for scientific information were seen as scientists, which I'll admit, as a scientist, makes me pretty happy about things. So people generally trust science and are curious about science, at least in these studies. Despite all of that, we still have this backdrop of information overload that I think can fall into these different categories. So here I'll define information as correct and backed by evidence. So information not being somebody's opinion, but where there is a body of evidence feeding in to lead to that conclusion. Misinformation would then be incorrect information, but the intent isn't necessarily to conceal. The intent could simply be the information was forgotten or misconstrued by accident. Whereas disinformation is defined as information that is intentionally false. So to give you a lighthearted example, correct information would be to say that I had tacos for dinner tonight and they were tasty. There is evidence upstairs to demonstrate that I had tacos for dinner tonight. Misinformation would be if instead I said that I had tacos for lunch. Because while I like tacos, I didn't eat them for 2 meals today. Now that wouldn't necessarily be to deliberately conceal. It could be that it's been a long day and I forgot what I ate what when, but I knew tacos happened at some point. Disinformation, on the other hand, would be if I told my husband that no, I didn't eat tacos and I don't know what happened to the leftover tacos. Now in this case, there were enough tacos for everybody. But there, I would be intentionally concealing my consumption of tacos. I think that makes sense when we look at those differences between the misinformation and the disinformation. Right now, we are in a flood of information in all of these categories. There's a lot of correct evidence-based information coming out every day about the current coronavirus pandemic. There's a lot of misinformation. A lot of cases, just people saying, here's what I heard, trying to convey real information, but not necessarily having checked those sources or verified. And there is also disinformation that we know is intentionally false and driven to mislead. All of this comes together, though, with this quote from the World Health Organization Director General, who said a few months ago, we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. In our 24/7 news cycle and with social media, there is information coming at us all the time. So let's take a look at a little bit of that information and misinformation. A lot of us get our information online, and sometimes it's theoretically easy to tell information, true information, from what I'll just call false information, which would be misinformation and disinformation together. For example, one of my favorite sources is a parody source, and that is The Onion. I happen to really like this headline. Politics was never this toxic in the 2010s, says future American while watching candidates battle in 2048 debate pits. For most of us, we see that headline and we get that this is farce. This is a parody. This is not true information. But what about more subtle yet still inflammatory headlines? Are those misinformation, and how do we really tell? And what is being done with this information? Now I'd like to share a couple of studies online that start to unpack how information and misinformation or false information is shared. And again, here I'm going to lump disinformation and misinformation together in these studies under the category of false information. This was a really influential study that came out a couple of years ago in the journal Science that looked at how much information and how fast information is shared on Twitter. And this was based on information from the 2016 presidential campaign, where the scientists tracked sharing of true information in green or false information in red. And here, false information was defined as information where there were multiple types of credible evidence that could support this information being false. And what they found, somewhat dismayingly, was that the depth, the more that information was shared and the number of unique users, so the more people saw the information, was different between the two, with the false information going to a lot more people with a lot more unique views than the real information or the true information. So this was a bit disheartening because it suggests that false information travels further and faster. And it's not that there are a number of reasons for that. In a lot of cases, false information, particularly disinformation that intentionally deceives pushes emotional buttons and usually has more hyped up wording. So something that really shocks and hits the emotion is not always, but often false information. But that gets people going, oh, wow, I can't believe this really happened. Everybody should see this. And they share. So even though I'll get to the how do we combat this later, one point now is if you're about to share something on social media because it's amazing, could anybody believe this is true? And it really resonates with you, I would say take a step back, wait for a minute, maybe like it if you're interested in doing so, but don't necessarily share that information because it's possible, more likely if it's really sensational, that it's likely false. Do a little fact checking first, and we'll get into the fact checking in a few minutes. There's also another study looking at social media. In this case, this was in BuzzFeed, so it wasn't necessarily a peer-reviewed study, but this was just tracking information over time leading up to the 2016 election. So now we're going from February to election day in 2016 and tracking Facebook engagement, so likes, reshares on Facebook for mainstream news sources versus, in this case, what they're calling fake news. And again, here, fake news were stories where there was clearly evidence to show that at least part of that story was false. There was enough credible evidence to dispute that news story, or at least parts of it. And what we can see is that early on in our 2016 election year, mainstream news was being engaged with much more often. But that declined as we got closer to the election. And by contrast, those fake news stories were engaged with much more often, again, in the run-up to the election. So we're seeing this rise in sharing and engagement with these false news pieces. What about in the current coronavirus climate and pandemic? There isn't as much information there because it's so new. But there are a few studies that are interesting and that I wanted to share. This first one is from a group in Spain, and what they did was looked at tweets, so Twitter posts from February about coronavirus, and rated those in a number of different ways, fact-checked the information to say, is this a post about true information or false information? And what they found was that posts on Twitter during the time that they looked at were twice as likely to contain false information about coronavirus than true information. Again, somewhat disheartening, but consistent with that 2018 study showing that false information on Twitter is going further faster. But this isn't saying it's going further. This is simply saying it's initially being tweeted, being posted more often. What gives me some hope is when they then looked at the retweets and found the opposite trend. What this team found was that true information was 10 times more likely to be retweeted, to be shared on Twitter than false information. And that this true information primarily fell into two different categories: fact-checking and evidence. So fact-checking was people retweeting information that talked about perhaps a not entirely correct therapy. So misinformation around a therapy, that fact-checking was true information that said, no, this therapy isn't correct, or this idea, this potential cure isn't correct, but didn't provide additional information by saying, no, that's not quite right. Whereas the information that was retweeted most often was evidence-based true information. So information that talked about clinical trials, that talked about increased testing efforts, that talked about case numbers with links to evidence in a lot of cases. So I think that tells us that true information is a lot more likely to be shared, particularly if there's evidence behind it, and gives us an idea of how we can be structuring our own social media engagement to make it more likely that our true information is being amplified. Now, I will say that this study was done in early February, so I can't say what current Twitter trends are looking like and whether these data still hold true. But at the time, again, true information was a lot more likely to be retweeted, which means that true information is getting out there. Another study looked at how true information is getting out there on Twitter, and specifically at the use of different hashtags. So I've called this study Hashtags Matter. And here they looked at what hashtags were associated with different types of information, true versus false information, and found that hashtags such as hashtag COVID-19 were more often associated with true information and were retweeted more times, whereas hashtags such as Corona or 2019 NCOV were more associated with false information and were less likely to be retweeted. So this also gets at how people that are portraying true information, often epidemiology or other public health related information, how they're using hashtags versus how others that maybe aren't speaking from that space are using hashtags. I think this also makes an interesting point, actually, that a colleague of mine commented on in a recent online commentary, which is that for science communicators that are sharing coronavirus related information in this current time, we can reach a broader audience by using some of these additional hashtags, by using, say, hashtag Corona. People that are looking at some of this false information or are trapped in one of those echo chambers where that false information is resonating, if we use a hashtag that's already part of their thread, that true information that we post may be more likely to rise to the top of their Twitter feed. So hashtags matter, and I think we can use this information from this study to help perpetuate some of the true information that is being shared on social media platforms. Twitter, of course, isn't the only place that people get information, thankfully. And the traditional news media are still a huge source of information and where a lot of people turn to, particularly older Americans. It's another study that just came out that then looked at sharing of coronavirus-related information on Fox News. I thought this was a really interesting study. So this is looking at 2 Fox News TV shows, one hosted by Sean Hannity and the other by Tucker Carlson. And here they did a survey of 1,500 American adults, all who identify as Republican, and all who were age 55 or over, because that's the demographic that is most likely to be watching Fox News. And they first determined that generally the viewers of Hannity versus Tucker Carlson are very similar in terms of their political views, in terms of their overall demographics, and that in general, these 2 shows share very similar information and have similar perspectives and takes on the news. However, they had very different takes on the severity of the coronavirus pandemic earlier on as the pandemic was unfolding. So Hannity continued to talk about the pandemic or talk about the coronavirus as not a big deal up until fairly late in March, whereas Carlson early on, as early as the end of January, started talking on air about the coronavirus as something that could pose a serious public health risk. What these researchers then did was ask the viewers of each of these shows, of Tucker Carlson versus Hannity, if they changed their behaviors around, say, hand washing and mask wearing or social distancing, staying home, and if so, when. So what we see at the top here then is Tucker Carlson, who started late January, early February, talking about COVID-19, the disease caused by the coronavirus, as a serious public health concern, and that his listeners made behavior changes on average late February, early March. Whereas Sean Hannity was on air not talking about COVID-19 as serious until mid-March, around the time that the presidential administration was declaring this a national threat, and that Hannity's listeners did not make behavior changes for another 10 days or so after Tucker Carlson's viewers. Now, 10 days isn't a lot of time, but when we think about the number of people that may be contacted by an individual during those 10 days, if they're not changing their behavior, that suggests that getting that information earlier, that message earlier from, in this case, a news source that these individuals trusted, was changing behavior in a way that could influence not just their own health, but the health of those around them. I'm not wanting anybody to take this as my endorsement of Tucker Carlson. Actually, most recently, he has been on the record of saying that maybe this isn't so serious after all, which I think is an incorrect statement by a long shot. But I do think this is an interesting study of the same demographic watching very similar news shows on other topics, but where the tone of the host on this one topic right now really did correlate with changes in behavior at very different times and how those could impact public health. News and trusted sources matter. So how do we change behavior? And as I said, I'm going to say right now, as I've said before, it is not easy. But there are some strategies to combat misinformation and hopefully change behavior. And I'll talk about a few of these. The first is to meet people where they are. Where do people like to learn about science, and what environment, in what kind of way? For many of us, we enjoy learning about science through Science on Tap. And I will then take a sip of water from my Science on Tap glass. Thank you, Amanda, for that. So right now, hopefully, I can't tell because you're all on the other side of the screen, I'm meeting you where you are. We can make it personal and appeal to emotion, because as a colleague of mine, Chris Volpe, said recently, we are feeling beings who think, not thinking beings who feel. So by connecting on an emotional level, we can help people think because we've tapped in first. For ourselves, we can fact check before we share. I mentioned this earlier, not automatically sharing something just because we went, oh, wow, look at this, but taking some time to see if it's right. And I'll show you a few tricks on how to do that. And finally, we can connect with people in a meaningful way. Let's just take a look at a few of these strategies. First of all, what doesn't work is what's called the deficit model, which has also been known as the sage on the stage. That's what so many of us professors get stereotyped into doing, which is we're going to stand in front of you and give you all this information and everybody's going to fall asleep. We know that doesn't work. Giving people facts does not change minds or behavior. Instead, other approaches work much better, like meeting people where they are. This study from a couple of years ago asked people where they liked to get information about nature, including potentially conservation information. And the responses showed that some people like to get information from online sources such as YouTube. Others enjoyed TV shows like Blue Planet, but that the most sought for source of information around nature was actually going out in nature and having this personal experience. So meeting people where they are personally, but also literally when we can, taking people out and experiencing science, in this case, nature around us, rather than just watching it online or reading about it in a book. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do those things, but it's meeting those people where they are that really matters. It also matters to make it personal, because most of us, and I'll definitely lump myself into this, are selfish creatures, or in this case, selfish pigeons. And we want to know with him, what's in it for me? Why should I care about this science? And this also gets back to making an emotional connection. These are data published by NOAA, so the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Always takes me a minute to remember the order of those letters. Looking at the number of extreme rainfall events over time from 1900 to 2010. And what you can see then on the left is the number of extreme rainfall events that exceeds that 1 in 5 year threshold, so that we wouldn't think this would happen more than once every 5 years. But of course, those thresholds are being exceeded these days, and we can see a rapid increase in those extreme events from 1990 until 2010. So this tells us that extreme climate events are getting more common. And for some of us, this is all the information we need. Look, it's a graph. But it's not personal. This is personal. This is a woman and a girl, presumably a mother and daughter, walking down a flooded street in their neighborhood in North Carolina following Hurricane Florence. This is a neighborhood that's been devastated by one of those extreme events. It's no longer a number. It's about people. Randy Olson, who is a scientist turned science communicator, really hits this in his book, published now a decade or more ago, called Don't Be Such a Scientist, where he talks about, for scientists, including myself, we like to talk to the head. And yes, that is a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, if anybody's wondering. But really, if we want to connect with people, connect with each other, and I'm talking to everybody, not just the other scientists in the group, we can share from the heart, talking about those emotional stories of how somebody lost their home or their belongings in one of those floods. We can aim a little bit lower for the gut, which can also be gut, like a gut punch, but can be humor. Or depending on how we're communicating, we can shoot a bit lower. Aim for the gonads, like when I'm talking about animal dating. That really, if we want to connect with people, for them to feel something, the heart is the bullseye. And that's what we see here. This isn't about a graph. This is about a personal story. And when I say a story, I'm not talking about making up stories, but that we as humans connect with stories, we remember stories, we don't identify with statistics as well. That's why journalists, if they want to tell a story about an extreme event, they might give us a few numbers, but they're going to find one person who was impacted and tell their story, because those personal, emotional stories matter. How else can we connect and maybe combat misinformation? I'm going to shift to what I think is a more fun or potentially tasty example of misinformation that's been floating around for years. Maybe some of you have seen the email. I know I've gotten a few of these emails forwarded to me that have unsafe in the headline or in the subject line that says, be warned, you shouldn't eat Cadbury chocolate. There was a disgruntled worker at the Cadbury factory. He had HIV. He bled all over the chocolate. Our chocolate supply is tainted. Everybody give up. Which to me, as a chocolate lover and somebody that decided to Cadbury my way through a couple of trips, this would be a calamity. But we can fact check this. For this sort of information, these general sorts of emails, Snopes is a great place to fact check. We see the headline, and I've underlined the punchline, which is old and false rumor. In fact, if you look at a lot of these emails, it's not just Cadbury, it's Cadbury and milk and several other products, ketchup, I believe, that all are the same email with just the food replaced, that have been circulating for years. This isn't true information. However, we also see not totally false information, but we often see more clickbait titles that have misleading information. That can also be a problem. And what we can do with those is investigate the source, find out what is the source that's posting this information, where's this title coming from or this headline, what might be that source's motive, find the original source. If this is a good news source, it should link to the original source of the information, so we can then look at that original source. And over time, build up a mental library or a bookmark library of trusted sources that we can get information for. And again, trusted, I don't mean they always agree with you. By trusted, I mean there are multiple independent sources of information that they cite that leads to this being an evidence-based source. And again, we can do this with another chocolate example. Anybody sensing a theme tonight? This was a clickbait headline from an article in Business Insider from a few years ago that chocolate is on track to go extinct in 40 years. Now, if you're paying attention a minute ago, you know that to me and to many of us, this would be a calamity because there's a decent chance that I will still be on the planet in 40 years. And I would be very sad without chocolate, and nobody would really want to be around me. So is this really true? What we can do then is find the original source. Now, this is Business Insider. They actually did say, here's where we got our information. This was actually some work done by my students where they were going through an exercise of identifying a clickbait, sciencey related headline, and then tracing the source and trying to find the true information. In this case, that Business Insider article links back to an article from the journal Climate Change, or Climatic Change, published in 2013. That was about future climatic suitability for cocoa farming from a couple of countries. So did this article say, no more chocolate in 40 years, everybody stock up, now it's going to be the next toilet paper? No, it didn't. The article concludes that some current cocoa producing areas will become unsuitable, requiring crop change, whereas other areas will require adaptations in crop management, and in yet others, the climatic suitability for growing cocoa will increase. So what this is saying is, as the climate changes, where cocoa can be grown will change, but chocolate is not going away. This gets back to our 3 different steps for looking at the source and then tracing that back to the original source. And by the way, that 3-step process comes from Mike Caulfield at Washington State University, Vancouver. What I've just given you is an example of inoculation, sort of a vaccine against false information, by saying, here's how information could be misleading, and here's how we can try to find the true information. This idea of inoculation and whether or not it works against misinformation was demonstrated in a fairly recent study about false information around climate change and this global warming petition project. And in this case, the researchers asked members of the public to read this piece about this global warming petition project and to either just read that or to first read a piece about either scientific consensus on climate change or a piece about how the tobacco industry intentionally misled the public decades ago. And then they asked, does first getting either of these sorts of information, either information about the overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change or about a completely unrelated topic, how the tobacco industry misled people, does that influence people's belief of this misinformation about climate change? And what they found is that in both cases, reading this pre-information made people more likely to question the false information. There was an inoculation effect. I bring this study up because I found it was particularly interesting that first, giving people this information in a completely different setting about the tobacco industry was still inoculating. Here it wasn't giving facts, it was teaching a thought process. How might misinformation be generated? What are some of the tactics that are used? And once people understood those tactics, they could then apply them in their own critical thinking about a new type of misinformation, in this case on climate change. I think this is a really powerful idea for how we can increase critical thinking in general so that people will be seeking out information and not taking, in this case, misinformation at face value. And finally, I want to end with a story about making personal connections. Several months ago, back when we could still all be out at bars and restaurants, I was sitting at the bar at a local restaurant having dinner. Woman sat down next to me, we're waiting on food, and we started talking. Pretty quickly, it turned to what we each did professionally, and I said, I'm a scientist. She then said, oh, that's really interesting. What do you think is the biggest scientific misconception or scientific hoax? And I said, climate change. She said, me too. I don't believe any of it. And I said, no, stop. What I meant was that the hoax is that climate change isn't happening, because it is all around us and we can see those data. She disagreed. We had a very far-ranging conversation, not just about climate change, but about all sorts of different ideas around scientific information, around government structure. Definitely didn't agree on many issues. But what I thought was really interesting about this conversation, and where I want to leave this, was in this case, I didn't get combative, which some of you that are listening know my usual state is to be combative about things. But instead, when she would say something that I was pretty dang sure was incorrect, I would say, well, that's interesting. What's your source? And when I would say something and try to provide factual information, I would cite sources, or if I didn't have a source, I would say, I believe this is correct. I think this is where I got this, or this is my opinion based on this information. And pretty quickly, her tone changed from this is right to, well, this is where I got this information, and I think it's right for this reason, or this is my opinion. She didn't walk away saying, I agree with the consensus on climate change. And the conversation wasn't just about climate change. It was, as I said, much more far-ranging. But in that 15-minute or so encounter, her tone changed to thinking about her own evidence in that short personal connection. And I walked away thinking, I'm really glad that I talked with somebody with very different opinions than me, that I got out of my own little comfort bubble or echo chamber and made a connection with somebody else, because so much of the evidence shows that people are most likely to believe information when they trust and have a relationship with the messenger. I'd like to leave you with that, of who are our messengers and how can we connect with others to be the messengers for trustworthy, credible, we have fact-checked it, credible scientific information. And finally, I just want to remind all of you that as we're all working from home, I mentioned this earlier, my lab members, my students are also working from home, and that they could really use your support. So I ask that you go out to our website, click on the Donate to Support Lab Members button, and this link will also go out in the email that Scott will send tomorrow. Thank you all for what I hope was your attention. Kind of hard to tell when I can't see everybody, and I will turn this back over to Amanda to lead the Q&A.
Well, thank you for the talk. There have been a number of questions. The first one I've gotten from a couple people. Are you willing to provide the links that you have of the various studies that you referenced in the beginning? Because a lot of people want to do their own research on this.
Absolutely. Yes, I will put together a document with links to studies. I will say not all of them are publicly available, given how science gets published, which is often behind a crazy paywall, but I will at least provide links to everything, and a lot of them are freely available.
And I also want to remind all of you who are watching that this video and the slides, the video of the slides will be available on our Facebook page and our YouTube page as well. So you'll be able to refer back to those starting tomorrow. So one question was, how do I encourage my friends and family to find the original source if they're wondering if something is trustworthy?
So first of all, if they're sharing information on social media that you know is not credible, calling them out on social media usually doesn't work. That tends to make people really defensive. Some people say, oh no, I posted misinformation. A lot of people double down because they don't want to look stupid. So the best thing to do there is to one-on-one, rather than in the middle of their Facebook feed, say, preferably over phone or Zoom, not just in a text, I saw that you posted this. I was wondering where you got that information, or I saw some different information. What do you think about this? And engage in a conversation. And I realize that takes a lot longer than just saying to somebody, hey, you got that wrong. But to have the conversation with a friend or family member about where they got their information, and to help them find credible sources. And in the current pandemic, a lot of those credible sources are things like the World Health Organization, particularly the CDC and the National Institutes for Health. are very credible sources within the US, as well as Johns Hopkins Public Health School and all of their mapping. So those are some very credible sources of information now. But again, it's the personal connection. It's first somebody who is going to be receptive to us saying, how about we try this? And then providing some links to more trustworthy information.
Kind of on a related topic, there was a comment saying, I recently read that the only way to quote unquote confront science deniers is not to argue facts, but to share their values. For example, we could all agree that we don't want anything bad to happen to our children, right? Can you comment on that, and how is it effective in dealing with entrenched ways of thinking or fact denial?
That is a very good question, and I can comment on it. And again, I don't have necessarily great advice here, because all of the studies say that if somebody has really doubled down on a particular position, it is very hard to change their mind. And that, again, facts generally don't change minds. But as you were just saying, as this question said, values do, if we can connect with personal values. So for example, somebody that thinks that vaccines are untrustworthy, often those are parents who want what's best for their child, and they only see that one child. And those are often people who are more convinced by an anecdote than by a body of evidence. So there was a study conducted by the Chan Zuckerberg Institute Initiative. I always forget what the I stands for. Recently, hasn't been published yet, but they did talk about these data at a recent conference. And what they found was about 20% of their survey of the American public were people that, regardless of the evidence of science, they were more persuaded by the one exception, by the one anecdote. So the one person potentially who was harmed by a vaccine, rather than the 99 plus who were protected. So in that case, we can change the anecdote and talk about the person whose life was saved because of that same intervention, and share some of those anecdotes. Now, the other thing that we can do, and I deliberately did this during my talk but didn't mention it, was to not repeat false information, even if we're trying to correct it or debunk it. There are a number of studies that show the more times we hear false information, the more likely we are to believe it, even if we're hearing it in the context of here's why it's not true. So rather than repeating back, I've heard this as well, or here's why this is wrong, but first repeating the false information or the misconstrued information, we can change the tone to positive messaging about constructive information and about, again, the stories of how somebody has been helped, those personal stories that are supported by the science. That said, if somebody is really entrenched in their opinion, I would just continue to build the relationship and maybe talk about other topics, and over time, see what conversation happens.
So we've had some questions about trying to assess the credibility of sources. So you mentioned the CDC and WHO, and there's been some, I happen to trust them, but there's been some talk around how they may or may not be trustworthy sources anymore. And then on some other levels, there are people who are claiming to be scientists, but have, they may be a neurosurgeon, for example, and have no background in infectious diseases or something like that. They, there's a scientist in one area, but have no expertise in COVID related things. How do you help people tease out what's actually true and what's reliable and what's not?
Again, that's a difficult question because it takes time. And one of the best ways to do that is to look at multiple sources. So to look at the National Institutes of Health, to look at the CDC, to look at Harvard School of Public Health, to look at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, to look at other major research institutions, and see if the information is corroborated by multiple independent sources that we would generally consider trustworthy, that are, in many of those cases, producers of scientific knowledge. Now, that's not to say in the current situation that you won't find slightly different information on some of those sources, because there's new information coming out differently. So in that case, it's not disinformation. It's this study came out today, this study came out yesterday, this clinical trial was just announced the day before. So some of that is just this infodemic, again, all coming together. But looking for multiple independent sources that corroborate is one of the best ways to identify trustworthy information. The other thing I would say about information in this current flood is, even though it's really hard, to not look every day. Because if we look every day, not only is it going to be overwhelming, but we're going to find contradictory things even amongst trustworthy scientists, because one scientific study, and I hate to say this as a scientist, but I know it's true, one scientific study doesn't get everything right all the time. Not because it was done incorrectly, but because maybe a similar experiment done under different conditions, different temperature conditions, different age of the cells or the animal or whatever, is going to yield some different results. So maybe take a break for a few days or a week, come back, see what information is corroborated by multiple sources. And this is also where peer review comes in. And Amanda, we've had this conversation about peer-reviewed studies, meaning studies that are published in scientific journals where the study gets submitted, it's sent out to multiple experts in the field who then weigh in on how the study was performed, on the results, and on the interpretation of those results. And then the study is usually revised, or the paper is usually revised based on that peer review, and then published only once the peer reviewers and the editor says, yes, we think this is a credible study. Is there still fake data that can get through peer review? Yes, there is, but with peer review, studies are much more likely to be credible. That's also one of the places where we see some issues right now. So many studies, because scientists want to share information with each other right now to come together and develop therapies and develop tests and develop vaccines, that a lot of scientists are publishing papers in what we call preprint servers, so non-peer reviewed places. And while that's still scientific information, it hasn't been independently validated by other scientists who have really dug through the data. So peer-reviewed studies, multiple independent sources that corroborate the same ideas, and everybody just take a break from the news from time to time.
This is kind of a question from myself, and I've seen some shades of this in some of the other questions. One of the things that I deal with as a science communicator is it's difficult to get across to people that science is a process, that it's a verb, it's not a thing, that, you know, there's a monolithic science that the word theory and scientific theory doesn't mean the same thing, like, oh, I have a theory that my dinner is cold by now or whatever. So how do you talk to people about what science is and how it works and how peer review is a thing that needs to happen, and how that whole process, while it does have some flaws, is the best situation that we have?
Like you just did. I'm going to throw that right back at you, is to do exactly what you said, which is that theory means something really different to us. When we talk about germ theory, that means bacteria and viruses causing illness, like what we're seeing right now with the coronavirus. We call it a theory because there might be something in deep space that we wouldn't identify as germ that could cause people to get sick, or and also we know it's not just germs that can cause people to get sick. They're genetic illnesses, but we call it germ theory, even though we know that bacteria and viruses can cause disease. Yet a theory is what we call something where the immense weight of scientific evidence is behind that concept. Theory is not a guess. And I do, and I recommend others do what you did, which is talk about science as a verb, as a process. And that gets back to forming connections, making relationships, because it's not a 2-second exchange of information. It's conversation over a drink, or a conversation over Zoom, or an ongoing conversation on Twitter, where it's not just a few posts, but a back and forth with followers to build relationships over time. Relationship. These days, distance, but relationship. Not socially distant, just physically distant.
Yeah, I learned something, or I heard a professor at PSU talking about this a while back, who was saying that in not specifically around science, but in trying to have a conversation around a controversial topic where two people have differing, or more than two people have differing ideas, is to say, okay, here's what it would take for me to here's the evidence I would need for me to believe the thing that you are telling me. What evidence would you need for you to believe what I am telling you? And see if that person is willing to engage on that level. And if they say, well, you can't say anything, nothing you can say would convince me, then maybe it's not worth having that conversation with that person. So that's
Yes.
making a comment. But do you have any thoughts?
No, I think that's a really valid point. Absolutely. I'm just going to say I agree with you.
Well, okay, I guess that we agree on that. So
We do.
been...
we agree on on many things: the importance of science, the importance of cats, the importance of a few beverages at times. Yes.
Indeed. A couple more questions. Somebody asked if there are any kind of role-playing opportunities for people to have a chance to try out some of these things. Do you have any resources or ideas how one could do that?
There are a lot of role-playing opportunities. I shouldn't say a lot. There are role-playing opportunities that are specific to science communication training. So, for example, at the Science Talk conferences, we've had workshops that are role-playing these sorts of scenarios. The Alan Alda Center for Science Communication, and yes, that is Alan Alda, the actor from West Wing and MASH back in the day. It's at Stony Brook University on Long Island. They do science communication boot camps that also include role-playing. Now, these are really targeted activities for scientists and science communicators. So more broadly, one of the great ways to not necessarily role play these scenarios, but to get comfortable with these exchanges and positivity is to try improv theater. Once improv is open, even though it has nothing to do with science, the whole idea of improv is yes and, not negating. It's yes, I'm going to take what you give me and I'm going to add something and give it back to you. And it's promoting a positive exchange. So while that doesn't directly answer the question, I still think it's a great way to practice the positive conversation skills.
I've also heard that there's been some research around, I think it was specifically around vaccine hesitation, where done by some physicians who they would get the families in the room and they would realize that the more they tried to hammer home the fact, no, you need to vaccinate your kids, no, you need to vaccinate your kids, the more that the reluctant families would push against that, because there was kind of an identity situation, like you're challenging me personally and my views, so I'm going to push back against that because I don't want you to think that I'm stupid or anything like that. Do you have any thoughts about how you can approach that, or are there any resources for where you can learn how to deal with that kind of resistance?
I know there are resources, a lot of resources for physicians. I'll admit that offhand, I can't think of those. What you say is definitely correct, that, again, if you challenge somebody's beliefs, especially an entrenched belief that has become part of their identity, they're going to become even more resistant to change and to contradictory information. In fact, there are also a lot of studies that show that providing contradictory information to somebody in that situation just makes them double down and even more convinced of their own beliefs, even though that information is contradictory. And so again, it gets back to discussing values, number one, and to building relationships and recognizing that right at that moment, unfortunately, that child might not be vaccinated. But that if you continue to have the conversation about the safety of your child, listening to that parent, making that parent feel heard, that you recognize their values, that over time there may be change. Now, there have also been some suggestions, and I don't know where this is at in terms of data, and I'll admit it's quite devious, that at least with older children, one of the suggestions is to suggest to the children that it's in their best interest to be vaccinated and that they take that information home. That's actually been shown to work fairly effectively with recycling. Whereas if you teach kids at schools the importance of recycling and how that can be important for the environment, they'll go home and tell their families, hey, we should start recycling. The same concept has been thought about with vaccine hesitation, but I don't know where that research stands.
And I have just one more question right now, unless something else comes in really good. How can we ourselves remain open to hearing and learning things that we may not like or that go against what we believe? That's the problem with the media and echo chambers. They can easily reinforce what we want to believe.
Yes. First of all, just recognizing that we are more likely, particularly in today's environments, to consume information that reinforces our own beliefs, because our news sources are generally going to fit with our conception of the world. The best way to be open, I shouldn't say the best way, one of the best ways, I'm not going to claim to have the best. One of the best ways to be open to that information is to seek out alternative news sources. So, for example, to get your news from 3 different news sources and listen and actually consider those opinions. To make friends with people who you know have differing opinions and have these conversations. To engage in these conversations on social media with people that have differing opinions and resist the temptation to tweet or post back, no, you're wrong, and instead actually think about it. And again, what you said, Amanda, was just to see the person's values, and that it really comes down to connecting on values. And then a lot of us share similar values about we want the best for ourselves and those that we care about. We might approach those values in different ways, and they might look really different. But I just keep coming back to it. It comes down to connecting with people and making a deliberate effort to get out and connect with people with different views.
Great. Well, thank you. And we, again, I want to mention that Ali is going to join in the text chat here. I want to say thank you to Dr. Allison Coffin for joining us this evening. This has been a fascinating talk. Clearly a topic that is near and dear to my heart as a science communicator. And so thank you. And I am going to share my screen for just a few last things. Let's go here. Wanted to talk about what is coming up next week. We are going to be talking on Thursday, May 14, on the topic high anxiety, the gut microbiota's health on, let me try that again. High anxiety, the gut microbiota's effect on mental health. And that is with Dr. Lisa Sardinia, who is an associate professor of biology at Pacific University. Lisa has spoken a number of times as well at our Science on Tap online or in-person events. And this should be an interesting talk about how what you put in your gut can potentially affect what goes on in your brain, which a lot of us dealing with anxiety right now, that may be a particularly relevant talk for some of us. So join us next week, again, Thursday, May 14 at 7 p.m. Pacific. And let's see, wanted to say a quick thank you. We have a number of Patreon supporters at all different levels, and the folks you see on the screen here are folks that have supported at $10 or more per month. They're going to get cool things like some of our Science on Tap stickers that I'm going to be sending out here shortly, and some of our pint glasses and various things. So thank you to all of you who have donated. We also got a fairly sizable donation about 2 hours prior to our going live today. So Wendy, thank you. Appreciate that if you are listening. And also, if you are interested in helping support us, you can join us on Patreon, or you can make a one-time donation at our makeyoutthink.org/support. That's through PayPal. I think it is generally how those payments get made. So if you enjoy what we do, if you learn something this evening, if you want to help us continue doing these programs and making them free for everybody to participate in, we kindly ask for your support. Even $5, even $2 will help. So anyway, thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you for participating and for being interested in science. And we hope to see you next week to learn about the gut-brain interaction. Have a good evening.